The Uncharted Mind, 15 Weirdest Things Medieval Folks Thought Were Real, and more. Prologue, The Anatomy of the Impossible. Forget the Crusades, the Black Death, and the soaring Gothic cathedrals. Those are the well-worn cliches of the Middle Ages. You think you know the world of kings and knights, but you only know the history carved in stone. The true, bizarre, and terrifying history of the medieval mind lies in the things they believed were as real as the bread on their table and the dirt under their fingernails. Things that were, by our standards, utterly and fantastically impossible. Imagine a world where your doctor diagnoses you based on the color of your urine and then prescribes a potion containing ground-up Egyptian mummy. A world where the map makers, supposedly charting the globe, included entire continents populated by people with no heads, dog heads, or only one massive foot used as a sun umbrella. A world where judges routinely put insects and pigs on trial in courtrooms, complete with lawyers and sentencing. This isn't fantasy. This is reality, circa 1150 AD. If you are an American reader accustomed to satellites and science, guaranteed to find information with a few taps on a screen, you must perform a mental time travel exercise. Turn off your inner skeptic. You are about to step into an intellectual landscape where fact, faith, magic, and science were not four different categories, but one single chaotic truth. Everything was interconnected. The stars dictated the harvest, a toothache was caused by a worm, and the only known way to repel a basilisk was with a rooster's crow. We tend to look back at the people of the Middle Ages, roughly 500 AD to 1500 AD, and dismiss their beliefs as simple ignorance. This is a profound mistake. They were just as intelligent, curious, and desperate to explain the world as we are, but they operated with an information deficit we can barely fathom. Their sources were scarce: a handful of text from ancient Greek and Roman thinkers, a strong dose of scripture, and centuries of inherited folklore. When these three sources contradicted each other, the resulting belief was often an astonishing, convoluted hybrid of philosophy, piety, and pure terror. This is the story of that world. It is a journey beyond the courtly dramas and the battlefield tactics, plunging into the very heart of the medieval imagination. We are going to excavate the deeply held, utterly convincing convictions of millions of Europeans, convictions that shaped their laws, their medicine, their art, and their understanding of their place in the cosmos. Prepare yourself. You are about to meet the blemier, the vegetable lamb, the toothworm, and the most feared animal of all, the judicial pig. These weren't stories, they were neighbors, pests, diagnoses, and realities. This is not just a history of strange things. It is a history of what happens when the thirst for knowledge collides with the terrifying, beautiful unknown.
Chapter 1. The Medical Monsters Lurking Within. The first, most immediate, and most critical sphere of medieval life was the body itself. If the modern world is defined by constant connectivity, the medieval world was defined by constant vulnerability. Without antibiotics, anesthesia, or modern hygiene, life was brutal and short. The body was a mysterious, treacherous vessel, and the prevailing medical beliefs often did more to confuse and terrify than to heal. For the medieval person, an illness was not a biological malfunction, it was an event with moral, cosmic, and often magical significance. The way they diagnosed and treated diseases reveals a startling fusion of the empirical and the utterly fantastical, the humoral imbalance and the power of phlegm. Every belief system needs a foundation, and medieval medicine stood squarely on the concept of humorism, inherited directly from the ancient Greeks, specifically Hippocrates and Galen. This wasn't just a theory, it was the indisputable scientific reality of human existence for over 1,000 years. The human body, they believed, was governed by four cardinal fluids, or humors: blood, hot and wet, associated with air, and the sanguine temperament, optimistic and social. Phlegm, cold and wet, associated with water, and the phlegmatic temperament, calm, lethargic.
Chapter 1. The Medical Monsters Lurking Within. The first, most immediate, and most critical sphere of medieval life was the body itself. If the modern world is defined by constant connectivity, the medieval world was defined by constant vulnerability. Without antibiotics, anesthesia, or modern hygiene, life was brutal and short. The body was a mysterious, treacherous vessel, and the prevailing medical beliefs often did more to confuse and terrify than to heal. For the medieval person, an illness was not a biological malfunction. It was an event with moral, cosmic, and often magical significance. The way they diagnosed and treated diseases reveals a startling fusion of the empirical and the utterly fantastical. The humoral imbalance and the power of phlegm. Every belief system needs a foundation, and medieval medicine stood squarely on the concept of humorism, inherited directly from the ancient Greeks, specifically Hippocrates and Galen. This wasn't just a theory, it was the indisputable scientific reality of human existence for over 1,000 years. The human body, they believed, was governed by 4 cardinal fluids, or humors. Blood, hot and wet, associated with air and the sanguine temperament, optimistic, social. Phlegm, cold and wet, associated with water and the phlegmatic temperament, calm, lethargic. Yellow bile, or choler, hot and dry, associated with fire and the choleric temperament, irritable, ambitious. Black bile, or melancholy, cold and dry, associated with earth and the melancholic temperament, pensive, depressed. Health was defined as the perfect balance of these 4 humors. Illness was simply an imbalance. A fever meant you had too much blood, hot and wet. Melancholy meant an excess of black bile, cold and dry. The remedy was not to fight a germ, but to restore balance, often through drastic means. The most popular medical procedure in the entire medieval ages was, by a massive margin, bloodletting. If you had too much blood, a vein was cut, and the bad blood was drained, sometimes via leeches, to bring the humors back into alignment. This procedure, performed for everything from headaches to plague, often tragically weakened the patient further, but because the foundational belief system was unquestioned, the practice persisted until well into the 19th century. Weird Belief 1. The Urine Prophet and the Uroscopy Wheel. Before the advent of basic lab tests, how did a medieval physician diagnose a patient? They certainly couldn't draw blood and analyze its contents. Their primary diagnostic tool was, astonishingly, urine. The practice, called uroscopy, elevated the examination of urine to an art form. Every doctor owned a uroscopy wheel, a circular chart displaying 24 different shades, from pale straw to nearly black, each color corresponding to a specific illness or humoral imbalance. Imagine the scene. A patient suffering from a vague malaise presents a flask of their morning urine to the doctor. The physician, often called a piss prophet, would hold the flask up to the light, not just noting the color, but also observing its clarity, smell, sediment, and even the appearance of any small particles or clouds floating within. A urine that was too clear suggested a failure to cook the humerus properly. Urine that was greenish hinted at excessive bile. If the urine was frothy, it might point toward a problem with the lungs. The diagnosis was almost entirely reliant on this single, highly variable sample.
The practice was so pervasive and so deeply trusted that when physicians were licensed, they often had to pass an examination based solely on their ability to interpret urine. It was a pseudoscience that dominated medical practice, often offering a comforting, if totally inaccurate, certainty in a confusing medical landscape. Weird belief 2. The dental destroyer, the toothworm. A toothache is agonizing, whether you live in 2025 or 1225. But while we blame decay and bacteria, the medieval person had a far more vivid and terrifying culprit, the toothworm. This wasn't a metaphor, it was a physical, tiny white worm that they believed lived inside the tooth and gnawed at the nerve. The pain was the worm burrowing deeper. This belief was not relegated to folklore. It was explicitly written about in serious medical texts, including those translated from classical Greek and Arabic sources. How do you kill a worm? Medieval folk medicine offered several colorful remedies. Smoke exorcism. The patient would be instructed to fumigate the tooth by burning a concoction of henbane seeds, which, when smoked, cause hallucinations and temporary numbness, and placing a funnel over the mouth. The doctor would then claim to see the small white worms fall out onto a bowl of water. In reality, the small burnt remains of the henbane seeds. Charming. Reciting specific incantations or charms over the afflicted tooth, often invoking Christian saints or biblical passages, was also a standard non-surgical treatment. The toothworm illustrates a core medieval intellectual habit. When a phenomenon was invisible, like tooth decay, they invented a plausible, visible, and tangible agent to explain the sensation. The pain was real, so the thing causing the pain, the worm, must also be real. Weird belief 3. The ultimate panacea, mummy dust, or mumia. If a medieval person was very sick and very wealthy, they might be prescribed one of the most bizarre and morbid medicines in history. Mumia was the name given to the drug derived from ground-up human mummies. It was not a rare or desperate measure. For over 500 years, from the 12th century well into the 17th century, mummy powder was a sought-after commodity in apothecary shops across Europe. The belief began with a misunderstanding. The Persian word mumia originally referred to a type of natural bitumen or asphalt used in ancient embalming that was thought to have great healing properties. When this bitumen became scarce, apothecaries began substituting the actual embalmed bodies of Egyptian mummies, believing the embalming process and the body itself held inherent preserved vitality.
Mumia was prescribed as a panacea, a cure-all, for everything from bruises and muscle aches to epilepsy and the plague. Its popularity created a grisly global trade route. Mummies were exhumed from Egyptian tombs. They were dried, ground into powder, and shipped in small casks. The powder was mixed with wine or honey and ingested. The demand eventually outstripped the supply of genuine ancient mummies. This led to an entirely new, dark industry, faking mumia. Criminals and unscrupulous doctors would exhume fresh corpses, criminals, paupers, or even plague victims, drive them in the sun or smoke, and sell them as authentic Egyptian mumia, sometimes even adding pitch or bitumen to make them seem more authentic. The tragic irony is that not only did the medicine not work, but those consuming it were often ingesting the bodies of recent plague victims, potentially spreading the very diseases they sought to cure. Yet the belief in its ancient, preserved power was so strong that it took centuries for doctors to finally accept that mumia was both ineffective and barbaric. Weird belief 4. The terrestrial impact of lunar lunacy. We still use the word lunacy, but for the medieval mind, the moon's impact on human health was not a metaphor. It was a scientific principle taught in every university. The belief held that the moon, Luna, directly controlled human bodily fluids, just as it controlled the oceanic tides. Since the four humors were fluids, The moon was thought to be constantly pulling and pushing on them, causing dramatic shifts in a person's mood and physical state. This meant that all medical treatments, especially surgery and bloodletting, had to be carefully scheduled according to the lunar cycle. A doctor would never perform an operation when the moon was waning, shrinking, because the body would also be shrinking and losing its strength, leading to a poor outcome. They had to wait until the moon was waxing, or growing, when the body's humors were believed to be at their most robust. Furthermore, any sudden inexplicable madness or emotional outburst was attributed to the moon's influence. The word lunatic was not an insult, it was a clinical diagnosis. This belief offered a convenient external explanation for mental illness, removing the social stigma of a personal failure, but replacing it with the inescapable power of the cosmos. Every calendar contained an almanac of the sick, instructing the user on the good days and bad days to get sick, take medicine, or undergo surgery based on the moon's phase and its position in the zodiac. The body, therefore, was not an isolated system. It was a fluid entity, constantly being tugged, influenced, and manipulated by celestial mechanics that were deemed more powerful than any physician's skill. This integrated view of the macrocosm, universe, and the microcosm, human body, was the bedrock of medieval science, making the stars and planets as vital to a diagnosis as a patient's pulse. Chapter 2. Bestiaries and Geography, and the Limits of the Known World. To the medieval person, the world was a book written by God, and every creature, every stone, and every distant land had a literal meaning, a moral purpose, and a real, terrifying presence. The exploration of geography was not just about drawing lines on a map. It was about confirming scripture and finding the wondrous, terrible beasts that populated the edges of creation. The primary source for natural history was the Bestiary, a richly illustrated manuscript that was part natural science, part religious allegory. These books, popular throughout Europe, described not only real animals, like lions and elephants, often hilariously misdrawn based on second-hand accounts, but also creatures that were considered absolutely, irrefutably real, despite never having been seen by any reliable source. Weird Belief 5. The Vegetable Lamb of Tartary, the Boromets. Travelers returning from the mysterious, distant land of Tartary brought back tales of a creature so strange it defied nature, the Boromets, or the vegetable lamb. This was described as a plant, a woody stalk that grew from the ground, but instead of bearing fruit or flowers, it bore a live, fully formed lamb. The lamb was connected to the stalk by an umbilical cord, would graze on the vegetation surrounding the plant. Once it ate all the surrounding grass, the lamb plant would die. This belief was persistent, appearing in texts from the 14th century onward. The plant was sought after for its sweet flesh, which tasted like real lamb, and its wool, which was said to be wonderfully white and fine. The likely truth behind the legend is a misunderstanding of a natural commodity. Tartary was a source of cotton, a plant fiber completely unknown to early Europeans. The sight of this woolly plant was so baffling that they combined the two known concepts, wool and vegetation, to create the impossible image of the vegetable lamb. Alternatively, the legend may have derived from the sight of sheepskins being used as packaging or tied to wooden stakes to dry. Regardless of its origin, the Boromets was a real organism listed in serious scientific and geographical texts for centuries, illustrating that for the medieval world, the further away something was, the more fantastic and impossible it was allowed to be. Weird Belief 6. The Basilisk, King of the Serpents. The basilisk was not just a myth. It was a looming, tangible threat that shaped architecture and folklore. It was the absolute, undisputed king of all serpents, a creature with powers that made the average dragon look like a house pet. Its fantastic qualities were universally believed. It was famously born from a rooster's egg that was incubated by a toad or a snake. Its lethality could kill in 3 separate ways. By sight, a single glance could cause instant death. By touch, its mere contact could scorch and wither. And by breath, its poisonous respiration could taint wells and kill plants. The basilisk was a problem that needed practical solutions. Medieval guides on how to deal with the basilisk were serious and detailed. The two known countermeasures illustrate the medieval mind's attempt to pit nature against itself. The rooster. The only sound that could kill the basilisk instantly was the sound of a rooster's crow. This led people in areas rumored to have basilisks to keep roosters nearby. The weasel. The only other animal that was immune to the basilisk's death gaze was the weasel, which was said to eat the rue plant, a known antivenom, before attacking the serpent. The basilisk served a moral purpose too, often being used by preachers to symbolize the devil or the power of sin. But its power was rooted in a genuine, fearful belief that such a terrifying creature existed in the darkened corners of the world, ready to be unleashed. The fact that no one had actually captured a basilisk only proved how deadly and evasive it was.
Weird Belief 7. The edge of the map. The monstrous races. Imagine a world map. On the familiar continents are familiar people. But as the map stretches eastward, toward India and the unknown edges of Asia and Africa, the human figures become increasingly bizarre. These are the monstrous races, catalogued by thinkers like Pliny the Elder and St. Augustine, and accepted as literal truth for 1,000 years. These weren't mythical creatures like elves or goblins. They were people, human beings that travelers and geographers fully expected to encounter at the limits of civilization. The most famous of these races included the Blemnia, men whose heads were located not on their necks, but in their chests. They were often depicted as fearsome warriors. The Cynocephali, men with the heads of dogs. They were said to bark instead of speaking, and were sometimes portrayed as pious Christians and at other times as vicious cannibals. The Cyopods, or monopods, people with a single massive foot. The size of this foot was useful, as they would lie on their backs and use it as a parasol to shade themselves from the hot sun. The Anthropophagi, vicious cannibals said to possess no mouth, eating instead through small holes in their faces. For the medieval mind, these races served a critical function. They represented the degeneration of humanity the further one traveled from the spiritual and geographical center, Jerusalem or Rome. They were the physical manifestation of being unbaptized, uncivilized, and untouched by the ordering force of Christianity. Their existence was less a question of biology and more a question of theology and geography. They had to be real because the classical authors had written about them, and the world needed a way to visualize the absolute other, the human being pushed to the very extreme limit of known nature. Weird Belief 8. The automatic compassion of the pelican. Bestiaries weren't just about bizarre monsters. They were also a source of moral instruction, and one of the most powerful and widely believed stories concerned the pelican. The common medieval belief was that the adult pelican was a supremely self-sacrificing parent. If a mother pelican returned to her nest to find her young dead, she would pierce her own breast with her beak and allow her blood to flow onto the dead chicks, which would instantly revive them. This act, the bird shedding its own blood to give life to its offspring, was taken as a literal factual observation of nature. Crucially, it became one of the most powerful and widely believed stories in all of medieval Christianity. The pelican, in her piety, was adopted as an allegory for Jesus Christ, who shed his blood on the cross to give eternal life to humanity. This image wasn't merely decorative. It was a core lesson in faith and sacrifice, appearing in stained glass windows, illuminated manuscripts, and cathedral sculpture across Europe. The belief in the bird's miraculous self-immolating compassion was so strong that it cemented the pelican's status as a universally understood religious icon, proving that the natural world for the medieval scholar spoke in parables and directly confirmed the truths of the Christian faith. Chapter 3. Justice, Law, and the Trial of the Beasts. The legal system in the Middle Ages was governed by a mixture of Roman law, canon law, and local custom. It was often harsh, usually arbitrary, and deeply intertwined with the belief in God's direct intervention in earthly affairs.
But no aspect of medieval justice is stranger to the modern American audience than the legal practice of putting animals and insects on trial. This wasn't folklore or a joke. It was a serious, official judicial process that occurred hundreds of times across Europe between the 13th and 18th centuries. Weird Belief 9. The literal guilt of animals. Zoomic trials. The notion of a zoomic trial, animal trial, was based on a simple premise. If God created all things, and all things operate under His law, then an animal that commits a crime, say a pig that kills a baby, or a swarm of locusts that destroys a vineyard, must be accountable for breaking that divine order. These trials were often split into two types. One, the criminal trial, the pig. The most common and most serious animal trials involved pigs, as they were often left to roam the villages and were responsible for numerous deaths, particularly of infants, in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Formal proceedings. The trial of a pig was a meticulously formal affair, treated with the same gravity as the trial of a human murderer. The defendant. The pig was captured, often dressed in human clothes, and held in a jail cell. The lawyers. A lawyer would be appointed to defend the animal. Evidence was presented, and witnesses were called. The sentence. If convicted, which was almost always the case, the pig was often sentenced to be hanged or burned at the stake. The execution was carried out in the public square, often with the same elaborate staging as a human execution, serving as a powerful moral warning to both the community and, presumably, other pigs.
2. The ecclesiastical trial. The insects. When the culprits were a plague of insects, weevils, caterpillars, or rats, the case fell under the jurisdiction of the church. The trial was about excommunication. The charge. The insects were charged with damaging the community's welfare and disrespecting the gifts of God, the crops. The summons. A formal legal summons was drawn up and read out loud in the infested area, instructing the pests to appear in court. Since the insects obviously couldn't show up, a lawyer was appointed to represent them. The defense. The defense often argued that the insects were merely following God's commands to eat, and that the humans were the true sinners, whose wickedness had brought on the plague. The verdict. If convicted, the insects were not physically executed. Instead, the bishop would issue a formal, devastating sentence of excommunication. This was believed to be so spiritually destructive that the pests would either die or miraculously leave the area, unable to survive while separated from the grace of God. The animal trial was not a sign of simple stupidity. It was an attempt to impose order and moral accountability on a chaotic and inexplicable world. If a pig killed a child, the justice system provided an answer, demonstrating that the human law was strong enough to encompass even the beasts. Weird Belief 10. Justice by water and iron. The ordeal. In an age without DNA evidence, forensics, or advanced interrogation techniques, how did a judge determine the absolute guilt or innocence of a defendant? They asked God to do it for them. The judicial ordeal was the preferred method of trial for serious crimes when evidence was ambiguous, and it was based on the absolute conviction that a just God would personally intervene to reveal the truth. The defendant's guilt or innocence was determined by their ability to survive or recover from a terrifying physical challenge. The most common ordeals were the ordeal by hot iron. The defendant had to grasp a scorching hot iron bar, sometimes weighing several pounds, for a certain distance. The hand was then bandaged and sealed. If 3 days later the wound was clean and healing, the person was innocent. If the wound was festering, the person was guilty. The logic: God would supernaturally shield the innocent hand from the flames. The ordeal by hot water.
the defendant had to plunge his arm into a pot of boiling water and retrieve a stone from the bottom. The outcome was judged exactly as the hot iron ordeal. The ordeal by cold water, the witch ordeal, primarily used later in the 16th and 17th centuries for witchcraft, the accused was tied up and thrown into a consecrated body of water. If they sank, and presumably drowned, the water, which was seen as a pure element, had accepted them, and they were innocent. If they floated, the water had rejected them as impure, and they were guilty of consorting with the devil. The amazing thing about the ordeal is that it was not seen as torture. It was seen as objective science and absolute theology in action. When it worked, it confirmed God's power. When the person was convicted, it confirmed their sin. The system was only abolished in 1215 when Pope Innocent III forbade priests from participating, removing the necessary holy sanction that made the ordeal functional. Yet, the belief in God's intervention through physical trials lingered on for centuries in local customs. Chapter 4. The Cosmic and the Earthly. Heaven, Hell, and Home. The medieval world was infinitely smaller than ours, geographically, but infinitely larger in its imaginative scope. The boundaries between the physical world and the spiritual realm were porous. Angels, demons, and the literal weight of original sin were forces as tangible as a passing storm. This spiritual reality governed not only their faith, but their everyday material culture. Weird Belief 11. The Tamed Dragon. The Power of the Mandrake. Dragons were considered real, dangerous, and often associated with great treasures and wicked behavior. Yet, the average person's greatest fear wasn't the dragon itself, but a plant, the mandrake. The mandrake, or mandragora plant, was real, a poisonous plant with a long, often forked root that vaguely resembled a human figure. The beliefs surrounding it, however, were entirely fantastical. The scream. It was believed that when the mandrake was pulled from the ground, it emitted a shriek so loud and terrifying that it instantly killed the person who harvested it. The birth. The plant was said to grow exclusively beneath a gallows where the bodily fluids of an executed man had fallen. To safely harvest this powerful magical root, medieval guides prescribed a morbid, elaborate ritual. A person must stop their ears with wax to protect against the scream. A dog would be tied to the plant's root. The owner would back away and throw meat toward the dog. As the dog lunged for the food, the tension would pull the mandrake out, killing the dog instantly, but saving the human harvester. Once acquired, a mandrake root was extremely valuable. Its human-like form made it an unparalleled magical amulet for luck, fertility, and protection. Witches and healers kept them, dressing the roots in fine silks and worshipping them, believing the little man of the root held incredible power. Its existence reveals how medieval botany fused natural poisons with theological fear and powerful sympathetic magic. Weird Belief 12. The Spontaneous Generation of Vermin. Where did everyday pests, mice, flies, maggots, and fleas come from? The medieval answer, inherited from Aristotle and accepted without serious question, was spontaneous generation, or abiogenesis. This was the firm belief that living organisms could arise spontaneously from non-living matter. Mice were believed to be generated from dirty rags and wheat stored in a dark corner. Flies and maggots were believed to arise directly from decaying meat or animal dung. Eels were thought to spontaneously generate from the mud at the bottom of a river. This was not a belief born of scientific ignorance alone. It was a necessary belief for the time. In a pre-microscope, pre-germ theory world, the sudden, overwhelming appearance of vermin needed a simple, observable cause.
If a pile of garbage suddenly began to swarm with flies, it was simply because the garbage created the flies. This belief had a profound impact on sanitation. If filth was the source of the animals, not merely their dwelling place, then the problem was one of matter transformation, not one of hidden causes like bacteria or disease transmission. It allowed for a certain philosophical acceptance of pervasive filth, a cornerstone of the public health crisis of the Middle Ages. Weird Belief 13. The literal weight of original sin. The central spiritual problem of the medieval world was original sin, the inherited guilt passed down from Adam and Eve. This wasn't just a theological concept, it was a physical, measurable force that influenced life and death. The literal belief in the weight of sin was most dramatically expressed in the practice of post-mortem confession. In some parts of Europe, if a person died suddenly and violently, an accident, murder, or suicide, without having received last rites or having confessed their sins, their soul was considered lost and condemned to purgatory or hell. The confession, to save the deceased soul, the living would gather around the corpse and attempt to conduct a post-mortem confession, asking the dead body to move a limb, open an eye, or make any small sign that the soul was willing to repent and accept God's grace. The miracle, if the body was believed to have given a sign, or if the community willed it strongly enough, the soul was considered saved. If the body remained still, the deceased was often denied burial in consecrated ground. This desperation illustrates the intense anxiety over eternal salvation. For the medieval mind, salvation was not a guaranteed ticket. It was a physical, ongoing struggle against the literal, crushing weight of sin that could only be lifted by the direct, interventionist grace of God, a grace that sometimes had to be solicited from the very corpse. Weird Belief 14. The magical properties of the rhinoceros horn. The unicorn is a well-known fantasy, but its real-world counterpart, the horn of the narwhal, often sold as a unicorn horn, was considered one of the most valuable and crucial items in a royal treasury. However, a lesser-known but equally powerful magical artifact was the rhinoceros horn. The belief was that the rhinoceros horn had an infallible, powerful ability to detect poison. This was an essential belief in an age of constant political intrigue and warfare. The artifact, cups, goblets, and drinking vessels were carved entirely out of rhinoceros horn. The function? If poison was poured into a cup made of rhinoceros horn, the horn was believed to either change color, sweat, or even shatter to warn the drinker.
Because poison was a silent, invisible killer, the perfect weapon of a jealous rival or a political enemy, the rhinoceros horn cup was a vital, practical defense. Kings, emperors, and high-ranking popes treasured these objects, relying on their magical, anti-toxic properties to save their lives. The trade in these horns was a highly lucrative and dangerous business, all based on a belief that blended exotic natural history with desperate practical application for survival. Weird Belief 15. The literal map of paradise. For the medieval person, the most real place on earth was a place no one could ever reach, the Garden of Eden or paradise. Unlike the modern view of Eden as a theological metaphor, the medieval perspective held that the Garden of Eden was a literal, physical place that still existed on Earth. It was simply placed so far to the east, often near India or China, far past the monstrous races, and surrounded by such insurmountable barriers, walls of fire, impassable mountains, or thick perpetual mist, that it was simply inaccessible to sinful man. This conviction had two profound, tangible impacts on their world. Geography, mapmakers or cartographers often included the Garden of Eden on their maps, mappa mundi, positioning it at the very top. The east was considered the top of the map. It was often drawn as a circular enclosure, the source of the four great rivers, Tigris, Euphrates, Gihon, and Pishon, and occupied the highest known elevation on Earth.
The Garden of Eden's placement on the map was a powerful reminder that their physical world was incomplete without its spiritual anchor. It grounded the entire cosmic drama of salvation in a specific, reachable, if forbidden location, underscoring that the Bible was not just a book of faith, but a genuine geography textbook and a guide to the hidden realities of the physical world.
Chapter 5. The Black Mass of Beliefs, Alchemy, Gold, and the Devil's Pact. If medicine and geography were confusing hybrids of fact and fantasy, the realm of alchemy and magic represented the pinnacle of medieval scientific ambition. It was a rigorous, often secret pursuit practiced by some of the most intelligent minds of the era, from friars and academics to kings and common charlatans. Alchemy was not simply proto-chemistry. It was a blend of spiritual transformation, metallurgical science, and mystic philosophy, all aimed at solving the world's most intractable problems: death, disease, and poverty. For the medieval person, the distinction between a miracle, a magical enchantment, and a complex scientific experiment was blurry. Magic was just science they didn't understand yet, often attributed to either divine intervention, good magic, or demonic influence, bad magic. Weird Belief 16. The transmutation of base metal into gold. This is the most famous quest of the alchemist, the attempt to achieve transmutation, specifically changing lead, a base, common, sickly metal, into gold, the perfect, noble, and healthy metal. The belief was founded on Aristotelian physics, which held that all matter was composed of 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire, and could be changed and refined. Alchemists believed that metals matured slowly within the earth. Lead was just immature gold. A skilled alchemist could simply speed up the natural process in a laboratory, or more accurately, an alembic. The ultimate tool for this was the philosopher's stone, lapis philosophorum. This was believed to be a mysterious, often reddish substance that, when touched to base metals, would instantly transform them into pure gold. It was not just a tool for wealth, it was a symbol of spiritual perfection. The successful alchemist had not just created gold, he had purified his own soul. The practical impact. Royal patronage. Kings and nobles across Europe, desperate for wealth to fund wars and courts, poured vast sums into funding alchemists. Royal courts were filled with men promising to deliver endless streams of gold. Scientific innovation. Though the transmutation goal was impossible, the alchemists' efforts led to genuine scientific discoveries. They developed new laboratory techniques, distillation, filtration, and significantly advanced metallurgy. Their failures were the necessary stepping stones to modern chemistry. The pursuit of the elixir. The philosopher's stone was also believed to contain the elixir of life, a liquid that could cure all diseases and grant immortality. The search for gold was therefore inextricably linked to the search for eternal life and health, the 2 highest possible achievements. Weird Belief 17. The Golem, man made by ritual. While the Jewish tradition of the golem originated centuries before the medieval period, the belief in the possibility of creating a living, breathing human being through ritual and formula was a profoundly real and terrifying concept in the medieval imagination, especially in Central Europe. The golem was a being animated by mystical Hebrew letters and ritual purity. Unlike the Christian concept of creation through divine grace, the golem represented a form of powerful, near-divine creation through human knowledge and mystical application. It wasn't born, it was formed from mud or clay and brought to life by inscribing the Hebrew word amet
truth upon its forehead. The fear and the belief. Controlling the uncontrollable. The golem was viewed as a perfect servant, strong, obedient, and without a soul. It was a physical body without the sin and willfulness of humanity. The theological line. The creation of a golem tested the most sacred line, the one between God and man. The belief that a rabbi or mystic could command the forces of creation was awe-inspiring and, to the Christian establishment, deeply threatening. Reality in folklore. The legend of the golem became so widespread that it influenced beliefs about automatons, animated statues, and other forms of artificial life, fueling a continuous medieval debate about where human intelligence ended and divine power began. Weird Belief 18. Demonic influence on physical objects, the power of the devil's pact. For the medieval person, the devil wasn't just an abstract evil force. He was a literal, contract-signing lawyer whose influence could be purchased. The belief in the devil's pact was one of the strongest, most pervasive, and most dangerous legal theological realities of the age, particularly during the later witch hunts. A person, often a witch, sorcerer, or alchemist who was failing in their work, was believed to have entered into a formal pact with the devil to gain secret knowledge, magical power, wealth, or the ability to fly. The mechanics of the pact. The contract. The agreement was often believed to be a signed contract, sometimes written in the person's own blood, guaranteeing their services to Satan in exchange for earthly power. The demonic aid. The devil would often provide the person with a familiar spirit, a small demon in the form of a cat, dog, or toad, to assist in the magical acts. The consequences. The belief in the devil's pact fueled the witch trials. A witness didn't need to see a person casting a spell. They only needed to see a string of unexplained bad luck, a successful harvest, or a mysterious death to conclude that a person had signed the contract. This belief provided a powerful, satisfying answer to inexplicable misfortune, placing the blame squarely on a human agent who had betrayed God. This was not paranoia, it was legal certainty. If a drought occurred, it was because God was punishing the community. If the drought was suddenly resolved, or if a neighbor's cow gave sour milk, it was because a demonic pact was at play, creating specific, localized chaos. The devil was a very real, very present part of the physical world.
Weird Belief 19. Sympathetic magic and the power of wax dolls. While grand magic involved the devil, sympathetic magic was the everyday practical magic of the common person, and it was utterly real. Sympathetic magic is the belief that things that look alike or were once connected retain a magical bond. The two main principles were law of similarity. Like produces like. Example, if you make an effigy of someone, what you do to the effigy happens to the person. Law of contagion. Things that were once in contact continue to influence each other. Example, possessing a person's hair or fingernail clippings gives you power over them. The ritual of the effigy, the voodoo doll. The construction. A person would create a small doll, often out of wax, to resemble the person they wished to harm. To make the connection stronger, they would integrate a piece of the victim, hair, clothing fiber, or nail clippings into the wax. The incantation. The practitioner would then perform rituals or stick pins into the effigy to cause injury, illness, or death to the victim. Courts and church authorities took this magic absolutely seriously. Finding a wax doll with pins in it near an injured person was considered strong, often undeniable evidence of sorcery and attempted murder. The efficacy of the magic was never in doubt.
The only question was the moral culpability of the practitioner. This belief ensured that every piece of garbage, every stray hair, and every discarded piece of clothing was a potential weapon to be carefully guarded, making the simple act of waste disposal a matter of magical security. Chapter 6. The Architecture of the Heavens, Cosmology, Fate, and the Stars. To understand the medieval world is to understand the medieval sky. Before Copernicus and Galileo, the cosmos was a meticulously ordered, perfect, and terrifyingly small place. The heavens were not distant cold gas. They were the literal home of God, angels, and the eternal perfect motion that governed all life on earth. Weird Belief 20. The immovable earth, or geocentrism, and the transparent spheres. The structure of the universe was settled science, geocentrism. Earth was an imperfect central sphere of corruption and change. Everything else was perfect. The universe was conceived as a series of concentric, perfectly transparent crystalline spheres rotating around the Earth. The inner spheres held the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. These spheres were made of aether, the perfect fifth element. The starry sphere, the eighth sphere, holding the fixed stars which moved together in lockstep. The primum mobile, the ninth sphere, the first mover, which imparted motion to all the others. The empyrean heaven, the final outermost realm, the non-moving dwelling place of God, Christ, and the angels. The sound of the spheres. The movement of these perfect crystalline spheres was believed to create a harmonious, beautiful sound called the music of the spheres. Though humans couldn't hear it because we are corrupted by sin and have been exposed to it since birth, this constant perfect vibration was a deep spiritual reality. This belief linked music, mathematics, and theology directly to the structure of the cosmos. This model was comforting. It provided a perfect hierarchy and proved humanity's absolute importance by placing us at the center of creation. Every peasant, king, and priest was the physical, ethical, and geographical center of creation. Weird Belief 21. Astrology as an indispensable medical science. Today, astrology is entertainment. In the Middle Ages, it was a rigorous, university-taught science absolutely indispensable to medicine, agriculture, and warfare. The premise was simple: as above, so below. The movements of the celestial bodies directly caused or influenced events on Earth. Natal charts. Every person's life was dictated by the configuration of the planets at the exact moment of their birth. An astrological chart was therefore a map of their destiny, temperament, based on the ruling humor or planet, and inevitable fate. Planetary rulers. Each planet ruled different parts of the body. Mars ruled the head, Jupiter ruled the liver, the Moon ruled the brain and stomach, hence lunacy. Astrological surgery. A doctor would never treat a body part when the ruling planet was in an unfavorable position. For example, you absolutely could not perform surgery on the leg when the Moon was in Gemini, which ruled the arms or shoulders, or worse, when the Moon was in Sagittarius, which ruled the thighs. Treating the wrong body part at the wrong time could result in catastrophic failure. Therefore, every serious doctor had to be an astrologer. Before diagnosing a cold or setting a broken bone, the physician would consult his charts to ensure the heavens were properly aligned. This was not quackery. It was simply the application of the most advanced cosmological knowledge available to guarantee the best outcome. Weird Belief 22. Comets, eclipses, and the prophecies of doom. In a world where the heavens were perfect and unchanging, any disruption was seen as a horrifying spiritual and political omen. Comets. Comets, or hairy stars, were particularly terrifying. They were seen as irregular, chaotic objects wandering outside the perfect crystalline spheres, and their appearance almost always preceded war, plague, or the death of a king. For instance, the appearance of Halley's Comet in 1066 AD was widely believed to be the sign that heralded the successful Norman conquest of England. Eclipses. Solar and lunar eclipses were moments when the perfect order of the universe broke down. They caused mass panic and were interpreted as signs that God was displeased with the current ruler, or that a great disaster was imminent. They were tangible, momentary lapses in divine protection. The constant monitoring of these atmospheric phenomena served a vital social function. They were proof that the world was still under the immediate, personal supervision of a demanding God, reinforcing the need for constant piety and political vigilance. The science of the day was inextricably bound to the theology of doom.
Chapter 7. Holy Relics and the Global Economy of Faith. No feature of the medieval religious landscape was more deeply believed, more heavily invested in, or more subject to fraud than the holy relic. These were not just mementos, they were believed to be physical, tangible pieces of the divine world, conduits for God's power that could heal the sick, win wars, and guarantee salvation. The belief in the power of relics created a massive, lucrative, and often hilarious global economy of faith. Weird Belief 23. The proliferating pieces of the cross. Every true believer knew that the true cross upon which Jesus was crucified was the most sacred object on earth. After the supposed discovery of large portions of the cross by Saint Helena in the 4th century, fragments began to multiply exponentially across Europe. The mathematical problem: by the High Middle Ages, thousands of churches, monasteries, and royal treasuries claimed to possess a verified fragment of the true cross. The amount of wood, when all pieces were collected and measured, was many times greater than the size of the original cross could have possibly been. The theological solution: the clergy and theologists did not view this as a problem of fraud. Instead, they theorized that the wood of the true cross had a miraculous ability to spontaneously regenerate and multiply as it was needed by the faithful. This meant that the fragment in one church was just as authentic as the fragment in another, because the divine wood was an inexhaustible, self-replenishing material. The belief was so strong that relics were often used in the most important legal and political rituals, with oaths sworn on them considered unbreakable, further cementing their genuine power in the mind of the faithful. Weird Belief 24. The Vials of the Virgin Mary's Milk. Next to the true cross, one of the most sought-after and potent relics belonged to the Virgin Mary. Dozens of churches across Europe, particularly in France, claimed to possess vials containing the actual breast milk of the Virgin Mary. The power. The milk was believed to be a miracle cure, specifically potent for fertility problems, healing eye ailments, and guaranteeing successful childbirth. The proof? Just like the true cross, the physical existence of this many vials of milk, hundreds or even 1,000 years after Mary's death, was biologically impossible. The relics were usually white liquids, powders, or lumps of white chalk, often explained as dried milk. The demand for these relics spurred a massive trade. The belief in the milk's healing power was driven by the deep, profound medieval devotion to the maternal and nurturing aspects of the Virgin Mary. To possess a piece of her body was to possess a piece of the divine, gentle power that birthed salvation itself. Weird Belief 25. The Trial by Relic. Relics were not just for healing. They were integrated into the legal system. The trial by relic was a specific judicial procedure, sometimes used alongside the ordeal, Chapter 3, to determine guilt. The ritual? The accused would be brought into a church, and a famous relic, a saint's finger, a piece of a martyr's clothing, etc., would be placed on the altar. The accused was forced to swear their innocence while touching the relic. The divine judgment. The belief was that if the accused was lying, the relic, sensing the spiritual falsehood, would cause the liar to fall suddenly ill, break out in boils, or in the most dramatic instances, die immediately. This belief in the relic's inherent active power to execute divine judgment served as a powerful deterrent against perjury. It transformed the court into a direct arena of God's will, where the evidence wasn't what a witness said, but how the divine material reacted to the touch of the potentially damned. Chapter 8. The Physics of Terror. Werewolves, Vampires, and the Walking Dead. The medieval world lacked the modern classification of creatures. There were no clear lines between monsters, animals, and demons. What we call supernatural phenomena were simply local, occasional, and terrifying occurrences that had to be dealt with pragmatically. Weird Belief 26. The Werewolf as a Legal Criminal. The werewolf was not a figure of campfire horror. He was a potential neighbor, and his transformation was not always seen as a curse, but often as a form of sorcery or demonic possession. The legal reality. In many parts of Europe, especially in France and Germany, people were tried and executed for the crime of being a werewolf or having used magic to become one. The trials were serious legal proceedings, with the accused having to prove they were not a shape-shifting predator. The belief in the ointment. The primary theory behind the transformation was that the individual had used a magical ointment, often a hallucinogenic paste, to cover their body, which granted them the ability to change shape and roam as a wolf. This linked lycanthropy directly to the devil's pact and witchcraft. The belief served to explain unexplained animal attacks. If a wolf attacked a shepherd's flock with unusual intelligence or ferocity, the natural conclusion was that it was a human in disguise. The werewolf was the ultimate betrayal of the human and Christian form, justifying the swift and brutal application of justice. Weird Belief 27. The Rise of the Vricolax. While the most famous vampire legends are post-medieval, the fear of the walking corpse, often called the Vricolax or revenant, was a profound and very real terror, particularly in Eastern Europe, Germany, and England. The fear was not of a romantic bloodsucker, but of a corpse that refused to stay dead because it was possessed by a demon or had died without receiving absolution. The signs. A person was suspected of being a Vricolax if they died suddenly, were unbaptized, or if their brave showed suspicious signs, such as a hole leading out of the dirt, or if livestock or relatives began to mysteriously sicken and die after the burial. The body was also believed to be uncorrupted, often appearing fresh, flexible, and full of fluid days or even weeks after burial. The solution: the community would have to exhume the corpse to stop the demonic influence. Standard procedures included driving a stake, usually wooden or iron, through the heart to pin the demonic body to the earth, decapitation to separate the body from the demon's control, or, most brutally, burning the entire body to ashes to ensure its complete destruction. The fear of the Vricolax was a public health measure dressed in theology. It was an attempt to understand and stop the spread of an unknown disease, or simply the natural processes of decomposition that were misunderstood, by assigning the blame to a visible, physical enemy, the unholy corpse. Weird Belief 28. Elf Shot and the Invisible Arrows of Illness. In the folklore and sometimes the medical texts of the Anglo-Saxon and Norse regions, sudden, inexplicable illness was often attributed to elf shot. The diagnosis:
If a person, or more commonly, a farm animal, especially cattle, suffered a sudden, sharp, inexplicable pain or a crippling weakness, it was believed that they had been shot by a tiny, invisible arrow fired by an elf or a malevolent fairy. The symptoms. This belief was used to explain a host of ailments, including epilepsy, sudden paralysis, fever, or even the symptoms of a stroke or heart attack. The pain was real, so the weapon causing the pain, the tiny arrow, must also be real. The cure involved counter-magic and specific rituals. Charms would be recited, or the body would be rubbed with specific herbs to draw out the invisible elf arrow. In many cases, actual prehistoric flint arrowheads found in fields were treated as the actual physical weapons that had been shot and lost by the elves, lending a tangible, historical reality to the supernatural belief. This belief demonstrates the common medieval need to assign an external, conscious agent to internal, random biological misfortune. It was easier to fight an elf than to accept a mysterious, untreatable ailment. Chapter 9. The Unfolding of Reality, the End and the Unseen. The medieval world was fundamentally different from the modern one because it lived under the immediate, constant expectation of the end of days. Eschatology, the study of the end of the world, was a practical, organizing principle for daily life, and it dictated many strange behaviors. Weird Belief 30. The literal geography of hell and purgatory. Hell and purgatory were not abstract states of mind. They were literal, physical places with measurable geography, specific chambers, and defined populations. The location? Hell was generally believed to be located deep underground, often accessed through volcanic vents, deep caves, or strange holes in the earth. Medieval travelers and monks sometimes claimed to have visited the entrance